Hi, everybody. I'm Bob Bowman, Editor-in-Chief of Supply Chain Brain. Welcome to this special presentation, Peak Season Readiness for High-Stakes Supply Chains, a strategy-first approach presented by Hy-Tek Intralogistics. Quick note, there will be an audience question and answer session at the end of this presentation. Audience members are encouraged to submit their questions at any time during the presentation by clicking on your Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Now, for supply chain executives managing complex, high-investment environments, peak season isn't just busy, it's business critical. And it's about more than just firefighting. You need a structured, data-driven approach that equips your team with the insights to act early, sequence improvements for maximum ROI, and build flexible infrastructure to absorb future fluctuations. Today, we're going to learn how operators are using peak season planning, not just to protect throughput, but also to pressure test resilience across their broader network. Now, before we get started with the main part of our presentation, we want to poll the audience on something here and kind of find out a little bit about you relevant to what we're going to talk about today. So here's the question. I'm going to read out the choices here, and I'm going to ask you to choose one of them. So, audience, has your team conducted a post-peak season analysis in the last 12 months? Here are your choices. Yes, detailed and data-driven. Yes, informal. No, or finally, planning to this year. Pick one of those that most matches your own experience and approach to post-season analysis in the last year or so. And we will see what comes up, and hopefully we'll be able to get some feedback from our speakers about how they feel about that too. Waiting now, this should be coming up just about any moment now. And here we are. Okay, so here are the results. 10% of you said yes, detailed and data-driven. 40% of you said yes, informal. 40% also said no. And then finally, 10% said planning to this year. So thank you very much for that level set, for that information about yourself. It's going to help us understand who you are and how our presentation goes today. With that, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. Ray DeMelfi is Senior Vice President of Strategic Services with Hy-Tek Intralogistics. Ray brings over 16 years of operations management and supply chain consulting experience with deep expertise in e-commerce, fulfillment, retail, wholesale, and consumer products. He's supported more than 50 clients across 125 plus engagements, spanning industries such as retail, 3PL, manufacturing, medical, aerospace, automotive, and the public sector. Ray's background includes leadership roles at Newell Brands and the execution of strategic initiatives for Fortune 500 companies. Welcome, Ray. And Lori Gibson is Vice President of Strategic Services with Hy-Tek Intralogistics. Lori has more than 20 years of experience in supply chain consulting, specializing in network optimization, facility planning, and operational transformation. She's led over 30 distribution and fulfillment center projects across retail, e-commerce, wholesale, and 3PL sectors. Lori's strategic insights have helped major brands reduce costs, improve service, and scale with confidence. Welcome, Lori. So with that, I want to pass over the presentation to Ray DeMelfi for the presentation portion of our hour here. So Ray, take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. So maybe just to do some quick introductions on who Hy-Tek Intralogistics is. So who we are is really an end-to-end strategy and operations company that helps execute both the strategy, development of the strategy, and then execute on the back end in terms of delivery of some transformation type project. For specific capabilities, like I mentioned, developing that strategy on the front end, whether it's helping you design your network or facility. We have an in-house software stack that helps from a deployment standpoint orchestrate in the form of a WMS, WES, WCS. We implement and integrate solutions, whether it's traditional solutions on the MHE side or automation and robotics. And then we help on the backside when it comes to realization of those solutions through our life cycle partnership team that really helps sustain and drive the operation on the backside. So the topic today, what we want to talk about is peak season readiness and why that's critical to the audience. Based upon that poll results, right? Sounds like a lot of our audience is going to really take away some really good information here and really drive the next preparation plan for your supply chain in the future. But what does it mean? There's really one good statistic that we like to lead off with in this conversation, and it's that when you look at your peak period, up to 30% of your revenue within that peak period could be consume 30% of your annual revenue within your order profile. It's a dramatic percentage of the business success as you look through that annual period. And really, when you think about it, it's a make or break moment, right, for your operation. Peak is such a large portion of that if you don't get it right, it really could mean the difference between success and failure for the entire year. So when we look at that peak readiness, it's critical to create a plan and execute on. That's really what we're going to talk to you all about here today. In terms of challenges, right, when you look at the peak period, and really, you could say these are challenges throughout the year, but they really become emphasized and really magnified as you look at that peak period. There's really four categories that you all struggle with on a day-to-day basis that we hear as we talk to our customers and see it, in person as we look across all the customers and all the different industries. First one being throughput limitations, right? Do you have the right solutions in place, the right systems, the right setup that is going to support that fluctuation in demand? We have customers that could have a peak to average surge of 5-6x what that average period is, and that's a dramatic shift, right? When you're talking about going from a day-to-day operation to 5 to 6x of what that day-to-day operation could look like, it makes it really challenging to operate in. Do you have the right equipment in place? That could be anything from lift equipment to infrastructure type equipment, right? When it comes to conveyance systems or something that's a little bit more static. Is it sized properly to support that peak period, that dramatic ramp up as we talk about peak? Or is it sub-optimized and not designed to support that shift? Space, right? Do you have that space allocation within the four walls of the building to be able to absorb that influx of inventory on the front end to get prepared for peak on the outbound side, right? Inventory consumes space. Do you have that space, and is it all that inventory properly positioned within the four walls to get there? Again, commonly a struggle, right? As you experience that ramp up. And then labor, right? There's three aspects of that labor piece that could become challenging, right? The cost of labor, right? It's continuing to increase, especially over the last couple of years where we saw a dramatic increase in the cost of labor. Do you have the right skills in the right positions within the four walls? And availability, right? Are you in a position where you could flex up your labor staff, again, like I mentioned before, 5 to 6x to be able to absorb that peak? Or are there going to be constraints there? So all those, when you couple those factors together, right, that's going to drive a higher cost if you don't get them right, and it's going to potentially lead to a dissatisfied customer on the backside if you don't get those right. Couple of statistics we'll lead off with that are really interesting because it really emphasizes the importance of getting peak season right. First one being a seamless and reliable delivery experience increases customer loyalty by 67%. That's massive. Second one being customers who experience reliable fulfillment during peak are 3 times more likely to become a repeat buyer. So you take those two statistics, you have the ability, if you get it right and you service your customers, whoever your downstream customers are, you could basically create customers for life, which is a massive opportunity, right? You have new introduction of customers during that peak period, right? People that haven't participated in procuring whatever it may be from you in the past, and you have the ability to create that loyal customer. On the reverse side of that, 60% of customers will switch to a competitor after just one bad experience, just one. And then 49% of your customers say they would stop shopping with a retailer after a single poor delivery experience. Again, dramatic numbers when you look at the reverse side of that. So not only do you have the ability to earn customers during peak, but you have the ability to basically deter customers and push them away to your competition. And the margins are incredibly thin. So you have to get it right. And during the stress of peak season, it becomes absolutely critical to have a plan in place to make sure that you're able to achieve that and really take care of the customer and service them properly. Okay, so what does that mean, right? When you look at the next peak season in front of you, the one that's immediately down the road, whatever it may look like, how do you get there? Well, the way we recommend you going about it is what we call a peak preparation assessment or readiness assessment. And that's really to put a plan in place to address this peak season. And what that looks like is you take a step back, you go through a workshop type of environment where you assess the operation and you look for those, what we call short-term and middle-term opportunities, and you build that into a cohesive plan. couple different objectives for this type of an assessment. And it really boils down to a couple different targeted pieces of objectives. First being productivity and efficiency. You want to look at the operation. You want to say, okay, is my staff, is my team well equipped to be as productive as absolutely possible? So when you go through that workshop, you're going to look for those opportunities to really remove those inhibitors, right, and enable them as much as absolutely possible. So they're going to be extremely productive and not creating wasteful movements. Capacity, I mentioned the inventory, right? Is your building properly positioned to open up the capacity needed to absorb that peak period, right? Do you have that capacity in the right places in order to support that? Visibility is absolutely critical. Do you know exactly where order progress is in the system, right? Do you know where your labor is in the system? Having that visibility, that's software driven, that's system driven, as you progress through peak, especially as you hit the stresses of peak and getting orders through the facility are absolutely critical. Do you have that visibility in place? Service, this one seems simple, but do you understand what your objectives are from a service expectation in peak versus non-peak, right? Those could be defined in two different ways, right? Did you understand, right, how service may slightly adjust during peak? What is your objectives? Do you have those clearly defined? System enhancements, right? Do you have the right functionality position, the right functionality in place in order to enable the operation? And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Product flows, right? Again, we talked about waste a second ago. Do you have the right products that are going to move through the facility, or product flows that are going to allow the product to move through the operation as effectively as possible and allow the team to operate without those wasteful movements? So when we look at those, what we want to do in this assessment as a team is really construct a plan, right? Hey, here's the 20 things you need to do in your readiness plan to go after to get you properly positioned during that peak period. And the absolute critical part about that, though, is to take those 10 to 20 items and prioritize them, right? Because you have a finite period where you have to get the operation prepared and positioned properly for peak season. So position those and prioritize those objectives, those opportunities properly. So you could go after the first 3 or 4 achievable items, right, and get those implemented and those in place for peak season and continue to iterate through that list. But if you prioritize them, if you get to the back end of the list and you would lose time, you're not wasting time on those that are less of a priority, right? You've already achieved those higher priority items. So again, it's critical to sit down, not only develop the list, but prioritize them and set that roadmap forward. So like I said, we go through this preparation. Lori's going to walk through the next 5 steps and what that process looks like, so that way you have a little bit of a better definition on how to go about it.
Thanks, Ray. Yeah, so the next piece is I'm going to walk through the steps. So there are 5 really steps that we go through when we do one of these peak readiness assessments. And really, it's interesting, I think, as we showed that statistic, that you had about 50% of the people replying that they did do this analysis after the last peak season, but really only 40% of those, well, 80% of that 50% said that they do, just a kind of a quick look at it, not a deep dive. So what we really think the important thing to really start with is data. And I think a data-driven approach is really the way that you gain a lot of insight and really put you on the right path to understanding what your requirements are for your coming peak. So the first thing to really do is do that data-driven analysis of that previous peak season and really get the details and understanding of what was going on during peak. So a couple of different things, and there are a lot of different ways to look at the data. We only put up 3 different things that are kind of that show some examples of things that you can look at. That first one is that wave planning analysis. And so, you have peak days you're going to have if you're a retailer, Black Friday, Cyber Monday, those are your really peak days that you're going to get the really big surges. But also within those days, there are peak times within those days that you're going to peak hours. And really understanding how that affects your whole flow through the business makes your planning a little bit, really drives down to what your requirements are on an hourly basis, and how you can plan waves and how you can sequence your product through your building a little bit better, a little bit smarter. So that's one thing to look at. The other, order profile summary, if you look to the right of that, really shows if the light blue in there is the number of orders and the dark blue is the number of units. So you can see that there's some orders that have you've got a small number of orders, but it's really a lot of your units, and then some that are not very many units, but a lot of your orders. And how do you plan for each of those separately? Because you're spending a lot of time with orders that it takes a lot of time to process maybe one order, but you're not getting a lot of units out of that. So what are the different strategies that you can use for each of those types to really maximize your performance? So we look at those. And then the other thing to do is, after looking at your past peak, really, what is that? How does that adjust that for what's this coming peak? What are your projections? Are you doing about the same? Are you adding more SKUs? Are you doing a different mix of product? And then looking at that and planning for your requirements, looking at what your productivity during peak was. How many workstations do you require in different areas? How many picking locations are you going to require this year? Where are the shortfalls, and where that kind of helps drive you on the next stages of what you need to plan for. And then that drives us to the second step, which is really this on-site workshop. And this goes back to what Ray was saying about, we really think it's important to bring in some outside eyes into this. So using somebody that is new to bringing fresh set of eyes and looking at your operation in new way, and maybe with some different experiences, and you know your operation well, but maybe you've been doing things a long time the same way, and maybe having a different perspective may bring in some value and bring to light some things that you haven't thought of that you could do that may really improve productivity and really set you up for a better peak season. So part of this on-site workshop is really doing on-site observations, just walking around, watching what's going on, interviewing people. And that means everybody out from the floor to your key operational leaders, to your management, to really understand the whole process and your whole business. And then doing that end-to-end process review. This is what Ray was talking about, looking at what we call some of these lean methodologies from industrial engineering, to really get in there and try to understand, are there ways that we can improve your processes to help you better prepare for peak? So the 4 P's of lean improvement, I don't think we need to necessarily walk through each one of those, but purpose, what's the purpose of what you're doing? What's the process that you go through? What are those exact procedures, and who are the people? And then those 6 areas of waste. Are there some things that you're not utilizing properly? Is it people? Is it some of your equipment that aren't really being utilized that you can get some better utilization out of that can improve your productivity? Is there excess idle time, people waiting for work? Excess motion, excess processing, people moving, not having product in the right places so that you're doing more transportation. All of these things, and looking at it and basing this and kind of helping you understand what those processes are. And that leads into the next step, which is our options evaluation. So after you get all the data and get all the data back, and you've gotten the on-site observations, then you start thinking of ways that, okay, identify what those requirements are. So where are those shortfalls? What are your constraints? Is it labor? Like, is it throughput? Is it space? Where are we having those shortfalls? And then that next part, what can we do to eliminate those? And the first thing we start with is processes. So are there some processes that can be streamlined to help meet those constraints? So that means doing those simple things, and this, sometimes we call it the low-hanging fruit. And these are the easy things to do. You can do these things, a lot of, or we call them quick wins also, things that you can come in, do relatively quickly and inexpensively that are going to have a big impact on your operations. And those, we really want to find those out, because those are helpful that you can put in place really quickly. The next piece of that is there any additional automation or technology that you can leverage to meet those constraints? So it depends on when you start. So if the earlier you start, the longer runway you have to get some automation and technology into your system. If you're starting later in the game, you may be limited on what you can do for this peak season. But it could be maybe some flexible conveyor, automated conveyor that you can add in, that you can do quickly, that can help a process. Maybe it's something like an auto bagger. The process is, maybe you can start batch picking single line orders and some of those, and then auto baggers in there. So what are those things that you can do quickly, or maybe even temporary? Can you get some temporary resources in there that can help get you through this peak? And then also thinking long-term too, as you go through this process, okay, we know this is a shortfall and we can't get this automation in this year, But remember that, because maybe that's something that you can look to in the future that's going to really help set you up, maybe not for this peak, but get you ready for the following peak. So that's something to keep in the back of your mind as you're going through this. And then, the other things, are there other temporary options that you can use? If you're short on labor, or what are the resources that you can do to get temporary labor? Can you access a 3PL that can help give you some manpower, or that you can move some product in? Maybe what type of product you can move in. There could be some bigger, maybe your ship alone type items are something that's good to, maybe you can shift to a 3PL that can help alleviate maybe space and labor, and then some outbound logistics. So these are all the things that you consider, and we throw these all on the board, really look at, like we said, try to come up with 20 to 30 options of what you need to do. And then look at, the first thing is that after-tax internal rate of return, which are going to provide the most bang for the buck. If you're looking at using a 3PL, or if you're looking at leasing off-site space, looking at both of those options and seeing which is going to be the better play from a capital investment and time, and some other more qualitative things, like, do you have the resources to be able to do that, to move people to an off-site location, or would a 3PL be the best thing? So first, we want to get all of those options, which leads into that readiness plan roadmap. So once you've got all those opportunities, it's really assessing those on that cost and effort and benefit. So how much cost, how much time is it going to take? And then what is the benefit of that? And from that, prioritize and sequence those. So the things that you're going to give the most bang for the buck, go ahead and put those and prioritize those, get those started. And then get that done, and then get alignment from the whole operations team. Maybe there's some different opinions, and you can maybe shift some things around, but then also after that, evaluate. So account for the complexity and the lead time, like we already talked about. Maybe you identify something, but there's really not enough time to get it in this peak season, then you have to put that on the back burner. But if it's something that you really need to get done, we really want this, maybe it's not the most priority, but we have to start this now if we want to get this in. So we maybe put it higher on the list. And that helps you develop this whole roadmap. So you have it up there, you're ready to go. And then you also develop that ramp up plan. When do you need to get labor in? When do you start needing to hire people? When do you need to start training to meet those goals? So you kind of work from where the end point is and work backwards to get this roadmap, and make sure, and I think these last 2 points are really important on the plan, is that monitoring and that contingency plan. So we all know, even the best plans, when you get going, and this is what our peak's going to be, this is what we're going to have, and then something happens. We had a client that all of a sudden got a huge peak and they didn't know what was going on. And somebody on TikTok had posted one of their products, unbeknownst to them, and all of a sudden they got this big surge that they weren't expecting. So even the best of plans are going to have bumps, and so it's good to monitor. What you're expecting your different peaks to be at a different day, and if it starts getting out of whack, then knowing, hey, we're getting a little higher, we've got more backlog than we were anticipating right now. What can we do to get back on track? And if you're getting there and you don't know what you're going to do, then it might already be too late. But having those contingency plans, can I add 2 hours to a shift? Can I work a Saturday? Can I get some additional labor? All of these things have some of these different levers that you can pull to help get you back on plan. And if you plan for it already, then you already know what you're going to do, and it makes everything a lot simpler. Next is step 5. Which is that last piece, which is that strategic plan. So coming out of this, and we've alluded to this a little bit with some of the automation, maybe that you can't get in for this peak. Maybe you're already out of space and you're out of space for this peak. What you really need to do is take these findings and leverage them so that you can do some type of planning so that you're not scrambling for the next peak. So some of these opportunities may include some bigger process improvements. Maybe there's some things that your WMS isn't able to do. Maybe you say, yeah, we'd really love to batch pick single items, but we don't have that capability right now with our current WMS. That gives you something to look forward to in the off season that you can start planning for. Maybe it is that you're out of space and you need to do a facility planning and design. Can you expand your existing facility? What can you do in your existing facility. So that's one of the things we have down there, that facility planning and design to what's your baseline space? What do you need in 5 years? And don't just plan for a year or two, but look forward so that you know, so that you're not scrambling and you have a plan in place. And then also, if you are out of space, should you add a different or a new distribution center, do a supply chain network optimization? If you already have multiple distribution centers, are they in the right places? Do you have your inventory split correctly between those? So it's good coming out of peak, knowing these things, utilizing the information that you've got, getting the data from your current peak, and then moving after peak, moving forward that strategic plan so that you're really set to be able to meet your future requirements and be ready to go.
Yeah, so just to conclude, before we move on to some panel questions, a couple key points, right? Plan early. Both Lori and I mentioned this, right? Start the process as early as possible, so that way, both from a short-term, near peak opportunity, you're getting as many of those enhancements, those refinements to the operation completed as possible, so you're well positioned. And then from a long-term strategy standpoint, start that process as early as possible, so that way you can get those longer-term initiatives deployed prior to the next. Utilize a data-driven approach, right? Understanding your profile and making sure you know what goals you're trying to achieve is critical to the process. That way, when you start to develop, as Lori mentioned, those solutions, right, you have specific objectives that are data-driven to go after, so you can align both the opportunity and the data requirements together. Formulate that roadmap. Again, we've emphasized this multiple times: prioritize, and sequence everything. So that way, again, you're getting things implemented effectively in the right sequence. And then develop that long-term strategy, right, to complement that short-term, right? You want to couple those two together. So one, you're positioning yourself for this next peak season, and then two, you're creating the right roadmap for the next multiple peak seasons following that. So you couple those all together to create that cohesive plan, and then refine that.
Okay, thank you very much, Ray and Lori, for that great information. It just seems like peak seasons are just becoming crazier than ever, and it just becomes so critical to have this type of preparation and strategy in place before that happens. Now, a lot of the things we're talking about here today are internal in nature, can be accomplished internally, but on this poll question, I want to ask you right now, it's about getting outside help, which is equally important and maybe not even more important in terms of finding that kind of expertise. So here's the question for you, audience, and I'd like you to pick from among 5 options here. The question is, which area of your operation would benefit most from outside strategic input? Here are the choices: warehouse layout or facility flow, labor planning or productivity, WMS, warehouse management system, WES, warehouse execution system, WCS, warehouse control system, alignment. A lot of alphabet there. Inventory and order management. And finally, network or capacity strategy. So pick the one that you think will benefit most from outside strategic input. We'll give you a few seconds to answer that. Again, this input will be critical and be very valuable to Ray and Lori as well, so we can understand where your needs are. All right, here we go. 17% said you'd benefit most in terms of warehouse layout, facility flow. 33% said labor planning or productivity. Another 33% said WMS, ES, and CS system alignment. 0% said inventory and order management, and 17% said network or capacity strategy. Interesting indeed. Maybe you guys would like to address that as we talk further, but it is now time for us to move on to the panel discussion portion, in which I have the privilege of asking some questions of Ray and Lori. And when we're done with that, we will move into the audience Q&A. Remember, audience, that you are invited to submit your questions at any time during this presentation by clicking on that Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. And when we get into that section, we'll get to as many of your questions as we can, time permitting. But first of all, I get to ask the questions first. Ray, this one's for you. You know, we traditionally think of peak season as a retail-oriented phenomenon, obviously. But talk to us about how this is also a consideration across industries.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, peak season kind of gets the headlines when it comes to the retail industry. That's where probably the most dramatic peaks are experienced, and those that really a lot of our customers see and feel. But every industry has peaks. They just look a little bit different, and they occur in different times of the year and behave differently. Some are unpredictable, and some are predictable. But you have to create that same mindset, right? It doesn't matter kind of what that peak looks like. You have to have that preparation, that readiness mindset where you're getting well positioned, again, whether it's predictable or predictable for that peak surge. Again, it doesn't change in terms of how you should approach it, whether it's retail, whether it's healthcare, food and beverage. Couple good examples that we've experienced, again, as we look across our industries. Food and beverage, right? Their peaks typically follow the holidays, right? As you look at, for example, July 4th, right? Great time to get together with family and friends, grill out, right? Everyone goes out and buys, hot dogs and hamburgers, and they see a surge, right? During or preceding and then following those holiday periods. A little bit more predictable, but they still have to plan to that behavior. So it's important for them to get inventory positioned properly in order to make sure that they're servicing those peaks, again, different times of the years. Another great example is healthcare. And this one's less predictable, right? We saw recently, actually as recent as last year, where there was a natural disaster that hit and dramatically shortened or reduced the inventory of IV solutions within the supply chain in healthcare, and created a unpredictable drop in inventory levels, and then a surge in inventory levels. And as that drop occurred, demand was building up, right? And we had to replenish the supply chain. So when that inventory became available, you saw a massive surge in demand and inventory in the network that healthcare systems had to accommodate and had to absorb. So again, a little bit more unpredictable, but what you have to do is make sure you create that plan to be able to absorb those fluctuations and get the throughput through the building. So again, from a readiness standpoint, build a plan that you can execute on as the year progresses, and then build a longer term strategy to make sure you have the capacity within your operation properly positioned.
Yeah. When you're thinking about long-term plan development, how can you deploy automation while maintaining flexibility for peak season? We talk about, don't build the church for Easter Sunday, right? What do you think, Ray? How do you do that? How do you keep that flexibility, but you're also planning over the long term?
Yeah, it's absolutely challenging, right? I mean, the phrase that you use is perfect, right? It is, how do you balance building the capacity in the network long term to support those surges, but then not overspending, right? Because there's a massive cost, right? When we start talking about peak seasons and the customer service expectations are continuing to grow tighter and tighter as we look across industries, right? The expectation is you have to get product to me, right? If I'm a retailer, you have to get product to the customer within 24 hours, and sometimes even tighter now because of the expectation that Amazon has set. So it's an absolute challenge. And every time you tighten that window of service, your cost increased and ballooned dramatically, right? And it's not proportional, right? That cost increases at a quicker rate than that service level tightens. So it's not an easy solve. What we emphasize is, first off, start that process for long-term planning earlier. So that way you could define and identify the right solutions that give you the flexibility and give you the capacity, and get them deployed, right, in the right timelines. So that way you're not scrambling. Good rule of thumb is, again, in the retail world, right, as an example, you really want to have those solutions deployed and commissioned, August, September before your peak. So that way you could settle, I should say, no later than August, September. So that way you could settle them, hit your steady state, and be able to service the peak season before ramp up begins. So again, having those plans deployed properly and in place. Also look at solutions that are flexible, right? There's a lot of automation and robotics and different new and challenging and disruptive technologies that are hitting the marketplace today than there was really 5 to 10 years ago. Good example being RAS, right? RAS solutions, robotics as a service. That's a really neat solution that allows you to scale your capacity and throughput based upon how your business is performing. So again, peak season is perfect, right? You could go and add more robots to your solution in order to scale up your throughput to accommodate the peak, and then reduce it back down when you're off peak.
Right.
Great partner of ours that we just added to our partnership profile is Locus Robotics. It's a collaborative cluster pick type robot solution that allows you, again, to add robots and add that capacity in a more dynamic fashion in that RAS type model. The great thing about those solutions is they're really, really productive, right? 2 to 3 times the productivity gains that you gain with those solutions versus kind of a more manual state. And then again, this is really important for peak. It accelerates the cycle time through the system, right? For an order, it could be 50% faster to cycle that order through the system, which is, again, when it comes to peak, massive gains, right? So again, deploying RAS type solutions allows you that flexibility. But I do want to emphasize, right, when we go back and we talk about that long-term plan, there's also a lot of things you could deploy that provide flexibility and immediate results on the short-term side. Great example is slotting, right? That is a very simple task that you could go and execute on in preparation for peak season that provides really the right effective and efficient process by just positioning SKUs in the proper locations based off of velocity, right? You could do that tomorrow, get that deployed and impact and create flexibility within the operation easily. It also helps create capacity because you could take those SKUs, consolidate them down, or position them properly, and you open up storage capacity again for those surges as we look at that influx of inventory. But then also just opening up, you look at the operation, opening up and reducing, kind of call it the messiness of the operation as it evolves over the year as you lead into peak, right? Great example is returns, right? Returns has that tendency to grow and the operation expand on the dock and consume more space than it really needs, right? Use these assessments to go and revisit that and then tighten that up and create the flexibility you need on the dock for outbound processing because you're going to need that, right? So again, there's little small things you could do in terms of creating that flexibility.
Returns have their own peak season, certainly expected following a peak season to purchases. Lori, what do you think? Do you have any observations here on the whole question of automation balancing long-term versus short-term and the like?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think Ray did a great job of answering that. And I think it is looking to flexible solutions. I think, when we talk about traditional warehouses, and a lot of times have had order routing systems where you've got rigid conveyor that's in the system. So when you're talking about trying to add capacity, it's really more difficult. I think a lot of the GTP type systems where you can add robots, things like that are a little bit more flexible because they're really easy to expand. You can add a module in, you can add a couple of robots, add a workstation, and you can plan for that. And you're not set in a rigid state with the way a conveyor is that you have to plan around. You can really move things around. It gives you a lot more flexibility. So I think long-term planning with using some types of robotics is really important because it does give you that inherent flexibility to expand. And a lot of those that are really modular, I think is really important.
Great. Well, Lori, let me ask you, from your experience working with customers across verticals, what do you think are the most overlooked gaps that operations teams fail to account for as they're heading into peak?
Yeah, and I think we hit on this a little bit before. I think, and I've got a couple of things here. I think one of them is not having that contingency plan, right? So you make a plan, you get it ready, and then something happens. There's an ice storm and you can't operate for 2 days or something, a big surge, anything happens and you just haven't thought through, what am I going to do if I start getting behind? What if those backlogs start having? So I think not thinking, you can make a great plan, but like we said, things are always going to happen, and knowing how you're going to handle those even little surges within the day, because if it starts to build up, then all of a sudden, if you haven't planned and you don't say, okay, we're going to add 2 hours to the work shift this day, then all of a sudden it can build up and you can get really behind. So I think having those contingency plans is really important. And I think the other thing is, when we talk about adding labor, so like Ray said, sometimes, we see a lot of clients, typical peak to average ratio probably is about twice, but it can be 3 to 4 to 5 times. So if you have that big, huge surge and you're adding all these people, maybe you're looking at it and saying, okay, I've got 3 to 4 times the surge. Maybe I need 3 to 4 times the people. And you're not really thinking about what's that going to do to your existing operation. I've got all these people picking and it's congested. And then my productivity drops way low. Or we're just going to double up people on a packing station. And then all of a sudden the productivity goes down, or we're going to just add a bunch of packing stations in here, but we haven't thought about the throughput. So it's really thinking about not only how you're adding people, but where you're adding them. Are you training them properly? Are you putting them in the right place? How do you manage this big influx of people into your operation and make sure that it's done in a way that's really that you've thought through, that you've got that plan, that you've developed the process for each of these people. And maybe there are processes that you do right now that one person handles, but maybe, which makes sense, but maybe could it be split into two processes, so that you don't have people running over the top of each other. So it's really thinking critically about how you're going to manage all these people and all this increase in labor in your building, and what that looks like and how that affects. Because typically we see productivity does drop a lot of times. I know one operation we had where they just were throwing a lot of people at a packing operation, and it was in sequence. And as we watched this, we realized there were people just standing there waiting. They had way too many people. We said, tomorrow, just use half the people that you have in that packing operation. And when that happened, they actually had greater throughput with less people, because it was just it was too congested in that area. So that's one thing that people fail to understand and really plan for.
Great advice. So at this point, I'd like to invite the audience in. Again, I've invited them to be submitting their questions all along, and we do have some questions that have already come in. As we are answering the ones that have already come in, you can continue to submit those. And once again, we'll get to as many of them as we can, time permitting. Let me start out with this one. The question is, how do you balance service and cost when dealing with peak? Kind of a little bit about what we talked about here, but Lori, maybe you could expand on that, because both of those are equally important, and yet they also have to be, there's a very delicate balance between them.
Right. And like what we said from that onset for some of those statistics that we did at the point, meeting people's service level is really, really important, because that can make or break you. But, you may have a service level requirement for most of the year that, you're going to get. If it gets in today, it's going to come out today. But we really see that customers really understand, especially around Black Friday and Cyber Monday, that they understand you're getting a lot of orders in, and maybe you can loosen that and accept a 2 to 3 day service. I think it's communication with your customer. But if you can do that and give yourself that leeway, a lot of times what you'll find is that you can really cut costs if you're not trying to build to that really surge, and you give yourself the ability to maybe smooth that peak across 2 or 3 days. You can really find a lot of savings from not having to gear up to that absolute peak. So think about that. There is a balance, like we said. You want to meet that customer expectation, but we do feel like some of these peak times, a lot of times for those, if you're buying, like for me, if I'm buying a Black Friday or if I'm buying Cyber Monday, it's typically something for the holidays. So I don't necessarily need it like through the rest of the year. I'm not expecting, I don't need it tomorrow. I may want it a week from now, but I'm okay with that. So making sure those customer expectations you're informed, but that you can loosen them up a little bit, and it can really have a huge impact on savings from a labor standpoint, and from, like we're talking about, all the gearing up, and like you said, building the church for Easter Sunday. If you've got it a little bit less and you cannot have to have it so maximum, it can really be impactful in your savings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. The questioner says, what would you prioritize first? Software solutions or automation in terms of long-term planning for peak? Ray, what do you think?
I'm glad you asked this question, because software is absolutely critical to peak readiness. In terms of sequence, in our opinion, software enables automation, right? To have the right software stack in place that has the right functionality that helps orchestrate is really going to enable automation. Really, our recommendation is to take software and either deploy it slightly in advance or in parallel with automation, because if you deploy in reverse, automation first, you're never going to get the full capability out of that automation. So it's really vital to make sure that you have that functionality in place in order to really enable it. We'll also say too, in terms of how it supports peak, and this is really critical, software allows you and enables you to basically handle the stresses and the uncertainties associated with peak, right? When you look at that average period, right, there's more forgiveness, right? Whereas if you have that peak period, right, there's less forgiveness. So having the right functionality in place allows you to remove the tribal knowledge from the operation. And that's critical, because tribal knowledge equals limitation, right? You take an individual that is the keeper of that information, you remove them from the operation in a manual environment, all of a sudden you create bottlenecks and limitations and constraints in the operation. So you have to shift that knowledge into the software, right? So that way you remove that individual, you could essentially just replace that individual with another and still maintain the core of the operation through that functionality embedded within the software. Great example I like to use during peak period is replenishment. The replenishment process, right? Having a system directed replenishment process helps take that tribal knowledge out of it, right? It's not an individual figuring out where the inventory is. It's the system directing them to, so it becomes more efficient, more directed, and ensures you have that inventory positioned properly for the picking process, right? So you could go and say, I know with confidence I could fulfill this order because the inventory is there, because it's a system-driven process. So again, software, absolutely critical, making sure you have the right functionality in terms of how you look at peak, and then really the automation to support it.
I imagine these giant letters hovering over us as we talk about software, and they are AI. I guess it's getting the software is getting a lot smarter these days in terms of helping you plan for peak, isn't it? So interesting. The interesting question here, what if our peaks are unpredictable? And I can see the wisdom of that question, because we're talking about there are different types of peaks. There are peak seasons that are entirely predictable. And then, as you guys said earlier, there are peaks that occur like, oh, what about a surprise review in social media that suddenly makes your product hugely hugely popular that you weren't ready for? So, Lori, talk about that. What if peaks are unpredictable?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question, because I think there are, like you said, there in today's world, there are a lot of times that you don't know, or you're not expecting a peak, and it comes along. But I think it's the same process though. And I think it goes back to having a plan in place and knowing what that plan is. So, especially if you're in an industry, depending on what you're in, that you know you're going to have these unpredictable peaks. I think it's having the plan and knowing what those levers are that you can pull. So when you see, okay, something's happening and we're tracking upwards, we're getting some more increased volume than we're expecting. What are those levers that I know I can pull? Is it, from labor? Is it that I can add extra shifts? How am I going to do that? But knowing what those are and what your plan is to execute those. Is it, doing labor? Is it, do you have a good relationship with a 3PL that you can maybe shift labor over to, or ship some product over to temporarily? It's understanding how you do what that ramp up is. It's the same process, adding people, maybe knowing if you're going to add some additional people, where you're going to put them, so that they don't have to be trained, that they can learn really quickly. Use your more senior staff to handle the harder, the more difficult processes. Easy ones are adding extra hours, adding a weekend shift, but knowing what you have available and being prepared so that when you see that, you're ready to go.
Interesting. You should talk about having a good relationship with the 3PL, because talking about peak seasons that are predictable, peak seasons that everybody is experiencing simultaneously, that 3PL is probably being approached by many potential customers saying, help. You don't want to be knocking on their door for the first time when there's a peak crisis, right, Ray?
I mean, absolutely not. So that's where I think going back to the fifth step in that strategy is developing that long-term look, so that way you could, like you pre-position, exactly where your levers are, you have those relationships established, and then you could use them as needed.
Okay. Ray, here's another question I think I'll direct to you, and that is, what should you consider doing following peak, when everybody goes, oh, okay, now what? What steps should you be taking?
Yeah, well, I know we talked a lot about readiness, right, and preparation leading into peak, but lessons learned, right? Going back and assessing how you perform during peak is just as important as that preparation leading to peak. So you could reevaluate, say, okay, where did we perform well? Where did we fall short? Then take that knowledge and carry that forward into the next assessment, right, where you're getting ready for the next peak. So that process is absolutely just as important, because you could take those learnings and apply them effectively. What I would also say is adjust your assessment cadence. So when you look at when you perform that assessment, look at it and say, hey, did we perform it too late in the process and we weren't able to get through all the initiatives and all the refinements that we had to get through? Or did we perform it too early and not really have a good definition of what peak looks like for us? So adjust that cadence, so that way you could better position that assessment the next go around. Again, that learning process. And like I said, iterate on that, right? Every year as you go through this process, so that way you're, again, constantly reevaluating how you're performing or how you should perform, and then how you did perform throughout each season.
Okay. All right. Well, once again, great presentation, great questions, great answers. Thank you very much, guys. Unfortunately, we are just about out of time. We have time for one final question. And Ray, I'm going to hit you with it. Here it is. What are the 3 most critical steps you need to take, short and long term, to be truly ready for peak? And how confident are you in your current plan to execute them?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Start off, know your goals, right? It sounds simple, but know your goals, know what you're trying to achieve. It's maybe to use a really a sports analogy, right? You use a scoreboard when you play a sport to understand how you're doing, right? Are you winning or are you losing? It's the same thing, right? Use the score, right? Use your metrics, use your data points to understand how you have to go after peak season and what you're trying to achieve. So start off there. Define your metrics, define your strategy. Perform the peaks, these assessments, right, each and every year. So that way you go in and you have a plan, right, for this peak season. Because this peak season is the most important peak season, right? It's not the next one, it's not the 5th one, it's not the 10th one. It's the next one. Because we talked about those statistics at the beginning. This is where your customer is going to be made or broken, right? Your opportunity is here. So create that plan immediately, and then build that long-term success or that long-term plan. So that way you can look ahead, but couple that with that short-term plan. So you get a plan in place and say, okay, what's the next one look like? What's the 3rd one look like? The 4th one look like? So you could sequence those steps in the process to get you there as effectively as possible.
Fantastic. Okay, guys, thank you once again for an excellent presentation with some really critical information from how to deal with peak seasons. We have an asset for you folks. It is a white paper, Strengthen Your Supply Chain in Uncertain Times. There is a QR code that you can take a shot of right now to access and download that white paper. If you do not have time to do that in the next few seconds, do not worry. This will be sent to all attendees of this webinar upon its conclusion. And by the way, if you are planning for 2026 and beyond, and who isn't, there's no better time to see what's possible. Come experience the Innovation Lab for yourself. Schedule a visit to the Hy-Tek Innovation Lab today and get hands-on with the future of warehouse information. Here's contact information for Roy, Ray, and Lori. Learn more about this subject from them. But for now, unfortunately, we are just out of time. Thanks again, Ray DeMelfi and Lori Gibson, for your fantastic presentation. Thank you, audience, for your participation and your excellent questions. To everybody, good luck with the next peak season. And for now, have a great day.